All right, so today we'll be talking about, well, I'll be talking about, you'll be listening and then discussing on the discussion board while still working on your exams. Um, Post Heideggerian thought. So, Heidegger, as I mentioned last time, 20th century, late 20th century, and 21st century philosophy goes through Heidegger, not around Heidegger. Heidegger is one of the seminal figures, especially in continental philosophy. And I talked about that distinction the first week. And so Heidegger then sees this human condition as one of hopefulness. Some French philosophers then, in the 1940s, 1950s, post World War II, then take Heidegger's initial insights and think it crippling rather than empowering. So one of those then is Jean-Paul Sartre. And he thinks that, well, as the excerpt points out, we are condemned to be free. Freedom is one of those things we think that we want until we get it. When we get it, then we have this absolute power. And he's not doing the Orwellian thing that corrupts absolutely. He's doing the Spider-Man thing. Obviously, he's doing it about 20 years before Stan Lee does. With that great power then comes great responsibility. And it's that responsibility that we find crippling. We don't want that responsibility. Just like Spider-Man continues to try to give it up. He doesn't want the responsibility, and so he doesn't use the power, but he has the power, and therefore he becomes responsible. And that's what Sartre is talking about here with regards to freedom. Right? When you think about freedom, I mean, think about, what folks have gone through recently, whether that be the penal institutions where they don't have freedom and then get out and they're thrust into freedom again with some restrictions, obviously, but a lot more freedom than they had before. If you've ever seen the movie Shawshank Redemption, right, the gentleman who had been in prison for quite some time, then when thrust into this world, didn't know how to cope or how to deal with the world, how to deal with that freedom. And I wonder, this is Schrappe wondering now, obviously there are tons of issues with corrections facilities and the penal institution and justice system and all that. Tons of issues. And those issues then play into things like recidivism rates and so forth. But Schrappe also wonders, I have a hard time keeping up with technology. And I'm still in the world, right? I haven't been removed from society. And I have a hard time keeping up. I can only imagine if you are removed from society for a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. How on earth then would you be able to deal with this freedom that you then have? You've become institutionalized so that you have gotten used to not having freedom. Now you have freedom, and on top of that's all this freedom that comes with this technology stuff as well. Whew. To some, that may be a condemning thing, a thing that they would want to escape from freedom, rather than to embrace freedom. Very interesting thing happened in the 1990s, primarily, a little bit into the early 2000s, primarily in the 1990s. After the Berlin Wall fell in the late 80s, and the Eastern Bloc nations then had this freedom that they didn't have before. People from the West had to go in and teach them how to be free. What does freedom look like? Right? If you think about a child, you just give them absolute complete freedom. Sometimes they're sort of lost. Right? I've been going through this with my own children at home. Right? So the schools closed physically, they were doing the online thing, and so I was helping them with their schoolwork and so on and so forth. We were establishing a bit of a routine, right? Not a rut, but a schedule, a routine. Here's what to expect and when. Now notice what that does is actually eliminates or mitigates freedom. If I give them the whole day to themselves, it's great for a while, and then a few hours later, I'm bored. I don't know what to do. Right? That the absolute freedom is just as crippling as no freedom whatsoever. And that's what Sartre is getting at. From a book called, I forget if it's Paradox of Choice or Paradox of Choices. I should look it up and remember which one it is. But in that book, the author talks about this overwhelmingness of freedom. And I forget if this is his example from the book or the example that I used in my own mind to understand what he's getting at. And my forehead's really shiny. Is the cereal aisle at the grocery store. Right? If you walk down, we have an entire aisle of cereal choices. Quite frankly, do we really need that many choices of cereal? Because here's what happens when Dr. Schrappe goes to the cereal aisle. I get the same things I always get. The same 3 or 4 cereals, that's it. It's too overwhelming. I don't try anything else because I don't want to take a chance on the thing that I try being a waste of money because it sucks. Schrappe feels this way about online news sources and so forth. There are so many. I have no idea which ones are good, which ones are bad. I have no idea where to start. The podcast thing that people are telling me, you should try this thing out and so on and so forth. There are so many, it's so overwhelming. What I would like would be less choices. Right? If there were only a dozen. All right, I can try each of those. But when there are hundreds or thousands, I don't even know where to start. It's too much. It's too much. So, welcome to life, says Sartre. That's life itself. This freedom. And it would be great if we didn't have, to reference the example I used last time with the greatest American hero, it would have been great if there would have been an instruction manual so that he would know how to use this suit, so that he would know what it is he's supposed to do with it, so that he knows what his purpose and meaning is. Sartre says many people turn to something like the Bible for that, right? For it said basic instructions before leaving Earth, which works great in English. Other languages it doesn't work that way because it's not Bible, but whatever. But even there, Sartre says, look, there's room for interpretation. He gives examples of POWs and individuals in concentration camps during World War II. And he says, look, events and circumstances are happening to these people, and what they have as far as the freedom things goes is the freedom to interpret these actions. Some walked away from God. Right? There's no just and loving God that would allow this stuff, allow this suffering, so on and so forth. It was a real crisis of faith for many Jewish people specifically, but people of other faiths as well, that that's how I interpret this, is there must not be a God. Others interpret it, no, there's still a God. I'm not going to question that. So what I must then question is our choices as a society or my own individual choices that have brought this about. Others, it made their faith stronger. Oh, wow, this is the suffering that the Bible talks about, and now I'm going to suffer, but I can make it through because I've got God. All of these are different interpretations. And who's responsible for the interpretations? Each individual. Each individual has the freedom to determine their interpretation. Okay? That's part of what Sartre is getting at. And so what this then does, this freedom to interpret then, is it leads to, and Sartre says these are not things that we have, because if it's something you have, you can get rid of it. I have hunger, I can get rid of it by eating. I have thirst, I can get rid of it by drinking, right? I have tiredness, I can get rid of it by sleeping. No. Sartre says these are the universal human conditions. Despair, anxiety, anguish, anxiety, despair. That's who we are because of the freedom thing. We're anxious, again, because there are so many choices, you don't know which choice to make, which then leads to anguish, which then leads to despair. Again, And I'm not getting into the comic book geek thing too much here, but Spider-Man is such a fantastic example of this. He's anxious. There's only one decision that Peter Parker slash Spider-Man has ever made that he is sure. And that was a wrong one. He let the criminal go free and then Uncle Ben died. That's the only decision that he's sure of. It's why J. Jonah Jameson is such a powerful enemy of Spider-Man. Because J. Jonah Jameson plays on that doubt. J. Jonah Jameson says, no. This guy who thinks he's awesome is actually awful. This guy who thinks he's doing good for the city is actually bringing about more ruin. There are a couple of storylines in Batman that kind of deal with the same issue, right? Batman's not the hero that Gotham wants, he's the one that they need, and so on and so forth. There's a fantastic episode of Batman the Animated Series where Batman himself is put on trial by the criminals at Arkham Asylum, saying, look, Batman, without you, there wouldn't be us. So you're the one that's responsible for all this crazy criminal behavior because you were crazy first. Great episode. You should check it out sometime. Spider-Man is fraught with anxiety. Oh, man, I don't know if I made the right choice this time either. Gee, should I have saved the train or should I have saved Gwen? Gee, should I have done this? Should I have done that? Even in hindsight, he's never sure. Because there's no instruction manual. Again, welcome to life, says Sartre. With this freedom then comes anxiety, which leads to anguish, which leads to despair. Not surprisingly, anxiety rates are through the roof right now. They were already at an all-time high, and the pandemic obviously didn't help matters. You know what else is at an all-time high? Depression and despair. That these two things do coincide. It's one of the reasons my wife specializes in those two things and trauma also. She specializes in three things: trauma, anxiety, depression. Why? Because they're all related. What does trauma do? Trauma makes you anxious. What does anxiety do? It makes you depressed. Then you isolate, which is another very teeny, remember I'm not the mental health counselor, teeny type of trauma in some degree, especially if all the other philosophers we talked about are right, then other people matter too, then other people in your life are an important part of the good life and so forth. So all of these things, Spider-Man is a personification of Sartrean philosophy. And furthermore, unless you get into the mid-2000s run of J. Michael Straczynski on Spider-Man, this is not something that anyone could control. Again, it was just a situation he was thrown into. Sartre agrees with Heidegger, we're thrown into life. Then it's up to us to choose what to make of it. And so Sartre here is an existentialist. Existence precedes essence. It's self-creation. Spider-Man is creating himself. Peter Parker decides and determines who Spider-Man is going to be. He may not be able to determine how Spider-Man is viewed by others. Right? He is not in charge of everyone else's interpretation of his actions, but he is in charge of his actions and his interpretation of his actions. One day I'll probably write Sartre and Spider-Man article or something. But I want to get to the text here to back up the stuff that I'm saying. Let's see. Where is this? So bottom 323. Man being condemned to be free. So again, this is a condemnation. This is a prison sentence. Freedom. Not, yay, freedom. This is, oh, shoot, freedom. Somebody please just tell me what to do. Right there, as awful as some of you may have thought school was, K through 12 education or whatever your background is, there was a certain rhythm and a certain routine, right? I mean, you knew for about 6 hours a day, somebody of authority, the teacher was going to tell you what to do. Hey, now it's time for math. All right. You may have grumbled and complained, but at least you knew because someone was telling you. Here's the meaning and here's the purpose for the next hour. Math, go. And there's some research out there which suggests that adults want more structure also. again, aside from the fact that we were ordered to stay at home for quite some time, and that so many places closed and we couldn't, right? We had a lack of freedom that many people began to then resent. But for some, it was a chance to pause and to rest, because they didn't feel free before, right? They felt they had to do this, had to do that, had to do that, got to go to work, got to go to school, got to do that, gotta. And so there was no time for anything else. It was so full of all of these obligations that they didn't have the freedom to then rest, do a hobby, learn an instrument, binge watch your favorite show. I don't know how people filled their time, right? But I wonder if how people filled their time is indicative of what they think the good life is about, or, to go back to Heidegger, their answer to the question of the meaning of being. And maybe it is about rest. Maybe it's about enjoyment. Many people, workaholics, miss the going to work thing. Perhaps that's an aspect of the meaning of being as well. Sartre here. Man, being condemned to be free, carries the weight of the whole world on his shoulders. There's that crushing and crippling responsibility. It's not just the power, that's the freedom bit, it's also the responsibility that comes with it. With every right, there's a corresponding responsibility, and vice versa. More on that in my Intro to Ethics class. He is responsible for the world and for himself as a way of being. And so in some ways this kind of lays the groundwork for, or foreshadows, the whole notion of be the change that you want to see in the world, right? You're responsible, right? If you're complicit, then you're saying everything is okay. It wasn't Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. who said that in order for evil to win, all it needs is for good to remain silent. Therefore, being complicit. If you're not part of the solution, you therefore are part of the problem instead. Isn't that what Sartre is saying here? He, meaning each individual and also the collective, because the collective is made up of each individual, he is responsible for the world. We're all responsible for shaping and fashioning the world. There's no God to rely upon, says Sartre. It's up to us. We would love it if there was a God that we could then place this responsibility upon. Well, I couldn't help it. God made it this way, or something along those lines. Or Lady Gaga, I was born this way, or something like that. No, it's us. It's us. If Wu-Tang Clan is correct and cash really does rule everything around me, then who is that fall on? Us. Us. We're the ones responsible for that. Of course, then you get the other classic rapper, KRS-One, whose initials stand for knowledge reigns supreme over nearly everyone. It's about knowledge rather than cash. Don't expect a white guy in a bow tie to be talking about KRS-One, but there it is. There are no accidents in life then on 324. So there is no place for someone to play the victim of their own life, says Sartre. This may or may not be what Schrappe says, but so says Sartre. I'm sure you have people in your life who everything always happens to them. This thing happened to me, then this thing happened to me, then this thing happened to me. Sartre says, whoa, time out here. Maybe look inward and look at the choices that you were making that may have led to these things and led to these circumstances and consequences, and accept some responsibility for it. Right? If your significant other has left you, if you have strained relationships with your children, if your pets all run away, if you can't keep a steady job, Sartre would say, look, there's a common denominator here, and it's you. Maybe you need to look at the type of person that you are, look at the choices that you're making. Again, he's not forcing interpretations. You have the freedom to interpret however you'd like. Sartre's just saying, maybe look inside, maybe look inward. Maybe look at the way that you're living your life that may be leading to these consequences. Now, obviously, that's not always the case, right? Sartre here is not necessarily victim blaming. This is not when one awful thing happens. No. This is when there's a series of things. This thing happens, this thing happens, this thing happens. Frequently, those are the people who say, this thing happened to me, instead of, I made a choice which led to this. Look what I decided, and look at the consequences. Sometimes, at least in my life, at least these are the people in my life, the victim people in my life are always looking to blame someone else by pushing the responsibility off on somebody else, right? Well, you told me such and such. You advised me to. You did this, you did this, you did this. Even advice, though, has to be taken and received, and then you act upon it. So ultimately, Sartre says, even that's on you. No accidents in life. A community event which suddenly bursts forth and involves me in it does not come from the outside. I choose myself from day to day, right? The self-creation thing. Again, you're not responsible for how people interpret it, but you are responsible for the person that you become. Because if you don't like who you are right now, then change it, right? If you do look inward and realize, wow, I've been a real jerk, that's why I don't have a wife, I have strained relationships with my kids, and my pets all run away, blah, 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 blah. Okay, then change. Be better than you were yesterday. This responsibility is of a very particular type, 325. Someone will say, I did not ask to be born. This is a naive way of throwing greater emphasis on our facticity. I am responsible for everything, in fact, except for my very responsibility, for I am not the foundation of my being. True, I did just get thrown into it. But now I have to take up that mantle. I have to go live life. I'm the one responsible for that. I have the power to become who I'd like to become. I have the responsibility then that comes along with that. I'm abandoned in the world. Now remember, Heidegger talked about being thrown and fallen. This disorientation thing, yes, but we're all disoriented, so we could be disoriented together. Sartre is saying, yeah, that'd be nice and all, but that's not the way it actually goes. Instead, we're abandoned in the world. Abandoned is very different than thrown. Thrown is disoriented. Abandoned is left and left alone with no help whatsoever from anyone else. That's abandonment. That's the human condition, says Sartre. We're abandoned here. So you can see how this takes a much darker turn, much more pessimistic turn. He's not going all the way to Schopenhauer, but I wonder if we're heading down that path. I find myself suddenly alone and without help. Now, Sartre is also going to say, look, and therefore we should help each other. But we're suddenly alone and without help, frequently, right? Which then leads to mental health issues and so on and so forth. And so, again, this pandemic and the stay-at-homes and the quarantines and so forth, right? This is an interaction, but it's not the same type of interaction with others, right? That once I hit the stop button or whatever, the record, you know what I mean? Once I stop recording, right, then I'm alone again. Unless I go hang out with my family, friends, what have you, which I can do now, but couldn't just a few months ago. I find myself suddenly alone and without help, engaged in a world, so there's engagement here, those ongoing projects, and the projects that I choose to engage in, go back to Heidegger, engaged in a world for which I bear the whole responsibility without being able, whatever I do, to tear myself away from responsibility even for an instant. Even the escapism thing, then, is a shirking of responsibility, but then you eventually got to get back to the world. It's great to binge watch whatever your thing is, right? 10 hours of it, great. Hour number 11, guess what? You're still in the world. Stuff was still happening while you were escaping. You're still responsible. I am ashamed of being born. This does sound Schopenhauerian now. Ashamed of being born. We talked before about someone who says that there's this self-loathing. We hate ourselves. We're ashamed of being born. I'm astonished at it. Or do I rejoice over it? Or in attempting to get rid of my life, do I affirm that I live and I assume this life is bad? Again, interpretation, choice, that's on you. Let me turn to Albert Camus. Oh, and Sartre I should mention. Probably better known as a playwright, actually, more so than a philosopher. He had a short philosophical text, Existentialism is Humanism, which a lot of folks have read. Being and no-thingness, or nothingness, depending upon your interpretation of the text itself, from which this excerpt comes from, his big kind of philosophical magnum opus, which a few folks have read from cover to cover. But most people are exposed to Jean-Paul through his plays instead. I'm not waiting for Godot, the other one. No Exit, for example. There is a line in there which says, hell is other people. Yeah, sometimes they can be. But what's the alternative? Abandonment? He also has a great little story, I guess I'd call it a novella, called Nausea, where he talks about this gentleman kind of being awakened to the world differently and beginning to wonder, wait a minute, where does my hand stop and start, and where does the doorknob stop and start? What is the subject-object relationship thing really like? And what it causes him then is anxiety, anguish, despair, nausea, discomfort. Ooh, I liked it better before, when I had less power, less responsibility. As counterintuitive as that sounds. Right there, and I talked about my sister-in-law last time, the military or the nunnery, right? But there is a certain in knowing that you don't have to make absolutely every decision, that you're not completely responsible because you don't have complete power. Many people kind of feel when they have a job and have a job description. Now I know exactly what it is that I'm supposed to do. I did not choose this job description, but these are the rules that I must now follow. I didn't have to come up with it on my own. One of Jean-Paul's French contemporaries, Albert Camus, probably also better known as a novelist than as a philosopher, but the French philosophers, at least of this time period, Sartre and Camus specifically, and we can see this a little bit throughout with some of the other philosophers we'll talk about later, think that writing a philosophical novel or philosophical play is a more effective means of explaining and describing their philosophy. Because remember, Heidegger wanted to talk about practical philosophy. What's philosophy mean for my life here and now? And so Sartre and Camus are going to kind of pick up on that. And this train continues to be run throughout mid to late 20th century and into early 21st century philosophy. Right? Let's get out of the ivory tower nonsense. Let's get practical on the ground again. Why does philosophy matter? Right? So these philosophical novels, philosophical plays, many more people are going to read novels and plays than are ever going to read a philosophical text. And since it is about life, it's easier then to demonstrate a philosophy rather than to explain a philosophy. Like, let's write a story where these characters are exploring philosophical ideas to get to the heart of what it is I'm talking about and what this means for life, rather than some type of tome or something along those lines. Here's a list of what to do's. Alain de Botton has done this as well in his book on love. Steve Martin, of all people, has a fantastic philosophy of art book called The Beauty of Art. But it's not a, hey, this is what's beautiful about art. It's a novel, right? And I bring up Steve Martin as I transition to Albert Camus. Steve Martin studied philosophy at community college out in California before he became a comedian. And so, I mean, Steve Martin has led a very interesting life. He worked at, his father was kind of a failed actor. In his early teens, Steve Martin himself worked at the gift shop at Disneyland. That's the one in California, Disneyland. And part of his salary then was determined by how much product was sold at the gift shop. So he taught himself how to juggle, play banjo, do all these other wacky, crazy things to get the tourists' attention so they may come in the gift shop and therefore may buy something. He then went to community college, took a philosophy class that by his own admission changed everything for him. And primarily what he was drawn to were the French existential philosophers of the 1950s. Especially, Schrappe thinks, though Steve Martin doesn't say this, especially Albert Camus. Albert Camus' big thing is absurdity. Life is absurd. It's absurd, right? And so he tells the story of the myth of Sisyphus. And that's the excerpt I had you guys read. And Sisyphus then, as you know from reading it, he's punished for some crime he committed on earth. And for all of eternity, he has to push this huge rock up this huge hill. It takes him all day to do it. And then it rolls back down the hill. He's got to walk back down and do the whole thing again tomorrow for all of eternity. And Camus says, welcome to life. Life is just you pushing a series of rocks that are just going to roll back down the hill. Everything that you accomplish is going to be unaccomplished eventually. That at some point you will die. You will probably be forgotten. All the stuff that you thought was so important while you were alive won't be that important to anybody else. Oh, I completed that project at work. Whoopee. Who other than you actually really cares? There's a very, very important line in the myth of Sisyphus. He says, in that moment, before the rock starts rolling back down, that moment of accomplishment, when he's pushed it back up to the top, we must imagine Sisyphus happy. It doesn't say Sisyphus is happy. It says we must imagine Sisyphus happy. If we don't imagine Sisyphus happy, then we never push any more rocks. We don't bother getting out of bed. Suicide, yep, let's go for it. Because everything's just a series of rocks anyway. And so Camus has this interesting dichotomy between kind of heroic defiance. Ha ha, I'm going to continue to push my rock, take that. Sort of like Hester Prynne from Scarlet Letter, right? The letter A, which is meant to be a source of shame, she takes up as a source of pride instead. The drunk driving plates, which are now colloquially known as party plates, right? It's meant to be shameful, instead becomes prideful. And so it's sort of sticking your middle finger up at your fate. Ha ha, I accomplished something. Take that. Then it rolls back down, you walk back down, then you push it back up and you accomplish it again. Ha ha, I accomplished it again. Heroic defiance. But there's also an aspect of just outright absurdity here. And it's interesting, there are other plays and novels and so forth being written about this same time. Luigi Pirandello, what is it called? Four Actors in Search of a Play, I think it's called, or something along those lines. Where what starts to happen is the fourth wall of theater begins to be broken down here. And so this is sort of the postmodern movement in art. Not that Sartre and Camus are postmodern thinkers necessarily, but this is the postmodern movement in art, where the artist lets the audience know that the artist knows that they're just in a play. This is, and so This is where we get actors in plays talking to the audience. We're giving them a wink and a nudge, like, we both know what's up, even though the other characters aren't aware. In movies, you see this in the original Muppet movie. The original Muppet movie begins with the Muppets entering a movie theater to watch the Muppet movie. At one point in the movie, Fozzie and Kermit, to say I can do comic books, I can do, Muppets. I try to cover all my bases here so I speak your language and can get to a reference that you understand. Fozzie and Kermit are going on their adventure, and they run across this abandoned church with Dr. Teeth and the Electric Mayhem, and they ask Fozzie and Kermit, so who are you guys and what's been going on? Why are you here? Kermit then hands him the script to the movie that they are in, right? Letting the audience know, look, we know that we're Muppets. We know that we're actors. We know this is a movie. And we're letting you know that we know that it's a movie. Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Very, very early on, I think it's within the first 5 or 10 minutes, Ferris Bueller addresses you, the viewer of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. This is crazy. And these are way different than Shakespearean soliloquies. Shakespearean soliloquies, Hamlet is ruminating, and we, the audience, happen to be there. He doesn't say, hey, audience, here's my question. Is it better to be or not to be? He's just thinking out loud in the presence of an audience. The Muppets, Ferris Bueller, are addressing the audience. It's absurd. Absurd. It's ridiculous. It's so ridiculous, we may as well embrace the ridiculousness and the absurdity of the situation. This is how Steve Martin interprets it. And so if you look at Steve Martin's stand-up routine then, he has the arrow through the head, which is obviously a hat, arrow through a head. That's the point. The point is, look, I, the actor or comedian, am letting you know that I know this is ridiculous, so we can all laugh about the ridiculousness of it. And so if you look at the stuff that he wrote for the Smothers Brothers or for any of these other comedy shows at the time, it's absurdist comedy. It's not necessarily social commentary. That comes much, much later. That's Dave Chappelle. That's Key and Peele. That's to some extent Jerry Seinfeld, right? That's social commentary comedy. 50s and 60s is just silliness. It's just ridiculous. Rowan Martin's laughing. It's just silly. It's escape. It's escape from the mundaneness of pushing the rock. There's a heroic defiance in sticking your middle finger up at your fate, but there's also ridiculousness in sticking your middle finger up at fate because fate's still going to win. You're still going to have to push the rock. Absurd. Ridiculous. Again, that's the type of comedy then that comes out, right? That's that there's an aspect at which laughter is important. Otherwise, you'll be crying constantly. Like if we focus so much on what's going on in the world, especially right now, but it's been going on forever. There is always bad stuff out there. There is always injustice out there. This is not Schrappe saying that's okay. This is Schrappe just letting you know, which I'm sure you already did. Look around the world, man. Read the news or watch the news from anywhere in the world, and there's some really awful stuff going on. Children dying, people starving, people being abused, people thrown in prison that don't deserve to be in prison. There is bad stuff everywhere all the time. And there's also really great stuff happening everywhere all the time. It's probably okay to laugh even though all those other bad things are happening all the time. It's absurd, right? There is this dichotomy. Even with situations that are tragic, they're so tragic. In some ways, they border on the absurd, not in the funny way, but in the this is literally unbelievable way. In the I can't understand how this is happening. I can't think my way into that thought process that leads to this thing. It's absurd to me. It's ridiculous. Again, not in the funny way, but absurd and ridiculous could mean absurdly funny or absurdly incomprehensible, incongruent with everything else that you know. And then Sartre and Camus kind of lay the groundwork for all French philosophy to follow, which then ties again back to Heidegger. Right? Another French philosopher of the time, Jacques Derrida, kind of goes a different direction, but still builds on Heideggerian themes. He wants to talk about this absence-presence thing with regards to language. So every time you think about dog, Derrida says, you're not just thinking dog, you're thinking about, in the background, all things that are not dog. That all of those things become somewhat present while you're thinking about dog. And that language itself then is this network that all works together. You don't just have dog out here by itself. Dog is connected to cat. They're not the same thing, but they are connected. And dog's connected to horse, and dog's connected to, right? It's connected to all these other things. And so to focus on one, these other things are also sort of focused on. Right? You bring them to consciousness. Right? And Derrida has tons of other interesting things to say about tons of other topics. Another French philosopher, so I guess it's kind of French philosopher day, post-Heideggerian, Michel Foucault, who wants to talk about power structures, right? And so with an inauthentic way of being with others, there could be things like oppression, repression, and so on and so forth. And Foucault says, yeah, every hierarchy is like that. And so hierarchies then reminds us of modern, postmodern, and so on and so forth, again from the first week. It's all about power structures. And so Foucault writes books such as History of Sexuality, Discipline and Punish, The Order of Things, where everywhere he looks, he sees certain power structures. And all of these power structures are working very hard to keep themselves in power. And so the power structure then determines what is normal and what is abnormal. And all of the abnormal then, the goal is to get them to be normal. Because by everybody being normal, the hierarchy remains in place, the power structure stays the same. Michel Foucault happened to be a homosexual. And so at the time that he's writing, the 70s and 80s, right, that's abnormal. Many people would go to therapists to try to become normal, which is to say heterosexual instead. And so Foucault then has real issues with the mental health profession itself, that rather than helping you get through your own life more effectively, better, healthier, instead he sees it as, I'm not a person, I'm a case study, I'm a problem to be solved. The problem is homosexual. The way to solve it, make it heterosexual, make it normal. The prison system. These are all of the abnormal folks. And so Foucault says perhaps they're not abnormal, perhaps it's not a matter of being normal, perhaps just a matter of being different. And so here again, there are these underpinnings, especially in Foucault, of not just postmodernism, let's question the hierarchy, but relativism, let's get rid of the hierarchy. That everyone's life is as normal as everyone else's. That homosexuality is different than heterosexuality or bisexuality or asexuality or anything else. All of these are different. None of them are better than. None of them should be preferenced over the others. And that sets up hierarchies again. And the whole hierarchy postmodern thing, best exemplified or best articulated by Lyotard, Lyotard, in a book called The Postmodern Condition, where he says this is what postmodernism is it's a getting rid of grand hierarchies, grand narratives, grand stories. It's not that we are all in one grand story together. No, 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 it's much more individualistic than that, harkening back to Sartre to some extent. Instead, I have my own story. You've got your own story, and you've got your own story, and occasionally these stories may share a paragraph or a page or something. But it's not a grand story. No, 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 no. Because then that leads to hierarchies. Here's the story, here's where everybody fits into it. No. Instead, I've got my story, you've got your story, you've got your story. My story is not better than, just different than. And then just in the last moment here before I end this video, if you're interested in Michel Foucault, and if you're also interested in comics, which you might be, I'd highly suggest reading Alan Moore's comics. Schrappe considers Alan Moore to probably be the greatest comic book writer of all time, especially his writing for Swamp Thing was fantastic. He explores issues of humanity, what does it mean to be a human, so on and so forth. And there's also some sexuality stuff in there as well. Right? What does love look like? What does that do for sex, so on and so forth. League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, same deal. There's some, for normal people, perhaps some very odd, abnormal love and sexual activity thing going on here. I think Alan Moore's pointing out, it's only because of your perspective, right? This is not necessarily abnormal. It shouldn't be fixed. Alan Moore also is the one who wrote V for Vendetta, so if you want to get into more political philosophy stuff, which Foucault and this power structure thing very nicely leads itself to more political stuff and political reform and so on and so forth. Also wrote The Watchmen, right? Who watches the Watchmen, so on and so forth. What does power do? Is there something very Orwellian? Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And what's interesting is at the end of The Watchmen, the character who has all power, the one who's like a god, removes himself. He escapes rather than engaging. And so that says something very interesting philosophically as well. For that contrast, I really like, and not that I like the rest of the movie, but the very end of Avengers Age of Ultron. Ultron and Vision are having a discussion about humanity. These two things are both entities that are greater than, something along those lines. Ultron, right? Humanity is frail, it's weak, it's finite, and therefore should be replaced with something better. Vision, because he's the good guy, says, no, 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 that's what makes them beautiful, is all this frailty and finitude and so on and so forth. They shouldn't be replaced, right? They should be helped. So is the meaning of life then to attempt to transcend our current condition? Or to embrace and find beauty in our current condition? Or is there a way to do both? That's it for this part.